It is my pleasure to have F. William Engdahl on the show. William is an award-winning geopolitical analyst, strategic risk consultant, author, lecturer. He's authored many books, including the international best-selling A Century of War, Anglo-American Oil Politics, Siege of Destruction, The Hidden Agenda of Genetic Manipulation, Full Spectrum Dominance, Totalitarian Democracy in the New World Order, Gods of Money, Wall Street and the Death of the American Century, Myths, Lies, and Oil Wars, and the most recent, The Lost Hegemon, Whom the Gods Would Destroy. William is a graduate of Princeton University, and he earned a postgraduate degree from Stockholm University. He has worked as an economist and investigative journalist in the United States and Europe. He was named visiting professor at the Beijing University of Chemical Technology and delivers talks and private seminars around the world on different aspects of economics, politics, with a focus on geopolitical events. William's website is williamengdahl.com. William, how you doing? Well, for you it's this evening. For me it's this afternoon. How you doing?
I'm doing fine, Timothy. It's 9 o'clock here in the Frankfurt area in Germany.
Oh,
Beautiful summer day.
Well, here it's a blistering hot day, but that's August. So
Okay.
Can't complain about that, really. It's the weather. Thank you for coming on the show.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
And, well, I think we communicated before the show that perhaps we could talk a number of things. My primary topic is your recent book, The Lost Hegemon. But there have been some current events. One is the failed coup in Turkey and the U.S. presidential election.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on those events?
You want to take it all in one ball of wax, or should we separate it out? Maybe you start with the U.S. elections.
Yeah, because that's kind of because the coup kind of blends well with your recent book. So let's
Okay.
Trump Clinton. We have a great choice here. What do you make of it?
There's this expression, the lesser of two evils, and I had a rather heated discussion with someone I know rather well in the Washington area, who was determined to vote for Hillary as the lesser of two evils. And I said, no, this is not the lesser of two evils, and to vote for either of them is to endorse the destruction of everything positive in the United States of America. Not that Obama is much better than Hillary, but, there are gradations. But this Hillary Clinton is the goddess of war. She is the one who personally took charge of the assassination of Muammar Gaddafi, the destruction of the most stable state in Africa with the highest living standard and the most peaceful economy, so that her friends like Sid Blumenthal and others could make some clever business deals, and that the neocons that she backs and the big oil companies can ultimately get control of the oil riches of the Middle East directly, militarily, or take it out one way or the other. So that's Hillary Clinton. I won't go into, because you probably have a mixed audience of family members, I won't go into Hillary Clinton's background as the first lady when Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas back in the 1980s and thereabouts, only to say that everything nasty that was written when Bill Clinton was under impeachment about Hillary and Bill Clinton's Arkansas dealings were understated. I have documentation of their involvement in the Mena, Arkansas Columbia drug cartel CIA shipments with the pilot Barry Seal, who later died mysteriously and abruptly. So dead witnesses don't talk, of course. And there's a trail of bloody bodies going from Arkansas down to Washington that follows the Clintons. The Clintons have been complicit, Hillary included, with the Clinton Foundation in ultimate corruption, using Hillary's good offices as Secretary of State of the United States of America to literally shake down sheikhs of Abu Dhabi and the United Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and other countries for the donations to the Clinton Foundation, of which Hillary, when she left office, became one of three principals of the foundation. So there are not only the leaked emails, which have revealed to any intelligence agency who's half awake the ultimate ultra top secret gamma encrypted communications of the National Security Administration. But Hillary Clinton belongs in front of justice. The FBI, Comey, punted as a political gesture. And he has no, by the way, the FBI has no business recommending prosecution or not. And a former whistleblower and a very, very senior NSA person said in an interview, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, that the NSA has every single email of Hillary Clinton, no matter what she did with her private server, and that the FBI has access to that had they wanted to know. So this thing is corrupt from top down in order to railroad Hillary Clinton into the White House. Donald Trump, on the other hand, is as American as apple pie, as American as Don Corleone and The Godfather. Roy Cohn was his mentor. If you know anything about Roy Cohn and the corrupt circles of Manhattan in the 1960s and 70s.
Gambino family, right?
Yes, the Gambino family, and not only that, it's a Vatican organized crime with Cardinal Spellman, who was one of the key architects. He was called the American Pope. He was so powerful in Washington and elsewhere. And Roy Cohn was his right-hand boy or man or whatever you want to call him. But Donald Trump comes out of these origins. You don't go into casino gambling in the United States if you're one of the Sisters of Mercy and Mother Teresa and so forth. You go into casino gambling because you're laundering money for drugs, prostitution, organized crime. And that is the background of Donald Trump. Now, maybe that gives him qualifications over Hillary Clinton to be president of the United States. That I leave to your listeners. But it's really, it's the idea of the lesser of two evils is a myth that keeps this system, both parties, Donald Trump is a little bit on the edge in terms of his rhetoric, but the man flip-flops and lies every 5 minutes, so you can't trust anything that he's going to say that it'll be real. So it's really, I think, symbolic of the collapse of an American empire that was built in the 1940s during World War II by Henry Luce, the founder of Time Life magazine, in an editorial in 1941 called it the American Century. Well, it didn't even make it past age 75, and the thing is collapsing on every front. The Gods of Money, title of one of my major books that you mentioned, The Gods of Money, Wall Street, they have hollowed out, rooted out, stolen out everything of value in the real economy of the United States of America. They've outsourced it. They've bought presidents to pass Glass-Steagall repeal and various other free banking laws that allow the Wall Street banks to have balance sheets larger than the gross domestic product of most nations of the world. Therefore, they use a very crude kind of blackmail. We are too big to fail. We, in the next financial crisis, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and so forth, Wells Fargo, you have no choice. You got to bail us out. Taxpayers, you are shafted, you are hijacked, you are tough luck, baby. So if we accept this, then why not vote for Hillary Clinton? Why not vote for Donald Trump? It's what we deserve. But I think we deserve better. I think Americans are a much better people, ultimately, the Americans that I know and I grew up with back in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. And I don't think we deserve the world of George Herbert Walker Bush and his Bush babies, Jeb and George W. and Dick Cheney and so forth, these neocon lunatics that are rampaging around. I think these are stupid old patriarchs that think they have a deed to the world, that they own the world. And they are really nothing other than stupid old patriarchs with names like George Soros, Warren Buffett, David Rockefeller, a few Rothschilds you can throw in there on the London side of the thing, but they're stupid, boring old patriarchs.
Now, you mentioned Donald Trump and his connections to gambling, and you said how that obviously gambling has always been a money laundering operation for organized crime and also for intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
He
Well,
bought
they
into
don't work together, isn't
yeah,
that?
yeah, but he bought into what Resorts International, which had a direct tie to Meyer Lansky, right?
Yeah. Well, not only Meyer Lansky, but the CIA. And
Yes.
that's the interesting thing. Resorts International is one of, they took over James Crosby before his mysterious death in the Bahamas. It took over the Bernie Kornfeld money laundering operation in Europe, which was a fairly crude by today's standards money laundering operation called Investors Overseas Services, IOS, back in the 60s. And they took that over, the whole apparatus, together with Meyer Lansky's networks, and set up these casinos called Resorts International in the Bahamas. And then Donald Trump bought into that. So this is CIA, this is organized crime. Meyer Lansky, for those too young to remember, was the founder of something called Murder Incorporated during the Great Depression.
He's right, and he's the one that was instrumental with his his associate Bugsy Siegel in establishing Las Vegas.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Las Vegas was built by the Lansky mob to launder money from Chicago, from New Orleans, from Dallas. People like Jack Ruby and so forth were part of this network. They laundered all the money through Vegas, where they bought every politician in sight. If you have a senator from Nevada, if you have a congressman from Nevada, you can rest your bets 9.99 times out of 10 that they're controlled by the mob.
Mm-hmm. And now
people like Sheldon Adelson are
that's right.
Players now.
And who is a oligarch, big player in both parties, but primarily Republican Party. It is rumored that he roughed up Harry Reid. I don't know if that's true or not. Harry Reid had an accident.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you hear about these things, but apparently,
Adelson is interesting from the standpoint that he also last time I ran across it was backing Trump in some way or another. But Adelson is the money bags, the daddy warbucks for Benjamin Netanyahu, one of the sleaziest characters on the world mafia scene, who happens to be Prime Minister of Israel. That's his front. But he hides behind the 6-star of David. But he's organized crime, Jewish organized crime, just like every other ethnic group has their rotten elements, and Netanyahu is one of them.
Yes.
But Sheldon Adelson, who runs these casinos in Vegas and now in Macau, China, where he did some very illegal things that the Chinese authorities were none too happy about, but it seems money greases a lot of skids, not only in the U.S. but in China, unfortunately. So he's still there, but he's making billions off of his Macau Chinese money laundering casinos there too.
These two candidates, though, I think it's safe to say they're puppets.
Oh, completely. Yeah. It's a script. It's a script, and the problem is there is no, as I see it, there's no cohesion, consensus in the patriarchs that run the show behind the scenes, the oligarchs, the American oligarchs. There's no consensus because their world is falling apart. And one faction who hires lunatics like Victoria Nuland in the State Department, excuse me for my blunt language, but this is what they are. Victoria Nuland, who organized the coup d'etat in Kiev in 2014 February to drive a wedge between Russia and the European Union, a peaceful cooperation between Russia and the European Union, and bring a bunch of neo-Nazis into Kiev as the government under Poroshenko and the prime minister. This is not being reported in your Washington Post, your CNN, your New York Times. These are die-hard neo-Nazi skinheads with swastikas on their arms, with baseball bats going around terrifying ordinary Ukrainians, whether they're Russian speaking or Ukrainian dialect speaking, to rob them of their property and kill them in some cases. These are just thugs, and thugs backed knowingly by the United States government. The aim of it was to just cut a line between the pipeline deliveries of gas from Russia through Ukraine. That goes back to the Soviet Union 25, 30, 40 years ago, those pipelines, and into Germany and other parts of the European Union, and force Europe to make an enemy out of Russia, which, to be honest, no European government wants to do. They don't want another world war on the European continent. For Victoria Nuland, it's, small beer to have a war in Europe because it doesn't affect her. What does she care? She doesn't care. She just wants to kill and murder and rampage around like her pal Hillary Clinton. So it's really, I don't use the term elite to describe these people because they ain't no elite in my book. An elite are people of very, very superior qualifications with the responsibility, the sense of office, the sense of dignity and love of their nation to lead them in a good way. These aren't elites. These are boring old patriarchs like David Rockefeller. My God, the man's 102, 6 heart transplants, according to some reports. Practice what he preaches when he sells eugenics, and take the heart out. He has the heart anyway. No, I'm not. I'm just joking. But the point is that these people have been there far too long for any good that they ever did. They're doing nothing but destroy. And look at what is going on across the other side of Europe in Russia. Look at what's going on in China. While we in the West can only destroy, they're building a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure project with high-speed railway links that are going to create a common market between Russia, Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia. Iran is now becoming part of that. It looks like Turkey may well become integrated with this whole Silk Road, it's called. The Chinese president proposed it 4 years ago, and it's going, the Chinese, when they settle on something, they don't dilly-dally around like Washington bureaucrats. They go full speed 24/7, and that's what's happening across Eurasia. It's going to transform the economic map of the world. There's virtually not a word said about this in any major U.S. media other than to deride it. But this is the most important economic development on our planet, in my view. And it's the way we're going to get out of this Great Depression collapse that these gods of money, the Wall Street banks and the London banks, have hijacked us into.
A couple observations. It is interesting to note that I think you've mentioned in a couple talks that the war hawks seem to be people like Victoria Nuland, Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, Samantha Powers, and they're people who have at least some elements of sanity, and at least had some elements of sanity in the Obama administration, were people like General Dempsey and Chuck Hagel, who apparently stopped the war against Syria, the overt war. So apparently you have these, you get these femme fatale experts who have no problem going up and stirring up trouble in Libya and Syria and perhaps other areas under the pretext of responsibility to protect or humanitarian intervention, these things. Well, one of the things interesting was recently we had these 50 so-called foreign policy experts who wrote a letter condemning Donald Trump. These are Michael Hayden, Eric Edelman, a lot of these usual suspects.
Yeah.
I guess this presents an image that there might be some difference here, because Donald Trump said some nice things regarding non-interventionism, skepticism towards NATO, even invoking America First, these things, and that's an anathema to the foreign policy establishment, which is all imperialist, right? So,
well, it's not at all clear what a President Trump would do, who his key advisors would be that would steer his economic foreign policy, his political foreign policy, his military foreign policy. That's not at all clear. It's a mix, it's a hodgepodge from what I've seen of neocons, some hardcore neocons like Elliot Abrams and Michael Ledeen, and some fairly sensible Western businessmen that have done business over years with Gazprom and other major Russian companies and find the Russians very, very respectable and honest to deal with. So it's Donald Trump, I have the impression, will do anything to get elected and say anything to anybody, and sometimes different things to different groups on the same subject. So that's the problem with Donald Trump. He's not qualified to be a president of the United States in any way, shape, or form. But neither was Jeb Bush. Neither were any of the Republican candidates. They're a bunch of morons. They deserve to go down in blazes like they did in the primaries. But Donald Trump is not presidential timber like a John Kennedy was, or people. Well, there are very few John Kennedys that we've had recently, but
well, if you act like John Kennedy, you might be treated like John Kennedy, so that they got the message.
Well, I don't know. He tried to shut down the CIA, fired Alan Dulles after the Bay of Pigs fiasco that didn't inform him. And all of that was well and good, but Lyndon Johnson got together with Alan Dulles and a bunch of agency people and Pentagon people because Kennedy was about to wind down the war in Vietnam. And this is documented. There's no question about this. And he wanted some kind of nuclear détente with Khrushchev. He had a back channel through the Vatican to negotiate this after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it was eyeball to eyeball nuclear war with Russia. And that and different things he did on the economy were just too much for the pals of David Rockefeller and General Cabell of the CIA and Lyndon B. Johnson, who despised the Kennedy brothers, Bobby and Jack Kennedy, to his core. So they rubbed him out. Not Lee Harvey Oswald. If you believe that, you believe in the tooth fairy.
Now, you alluded to, as you mentioned, a very important point. That is the economic development that's occurring, and also the linkage that's occurring, or at least the natural linkage that you think would develop between China, Russia, and in Europe. And this is threatening to develop a sort of a development model outside the Anglo-American order. The pipelines, the railways, the trade. This would marginalize the dollar. This would facilitate, or at least accelerate, the de-dollarization of the global economy, which would challenge the Anglo-American empire. This is very similar to a problem that the British Empire had with Germany and Russia in the early part of the 20th century, and this Mackinder Doctrine. And this Mackinder Doctrine factors greatly, although he developed this in the early part of the 20th century, it's still relevant today because I think it's the guiding ideology of the Anglo-American Zionist empire, I guess. The sea power controlling the center, Eurasia. And you covered this in your book, The Lost Hegemon. How does it? Is it similar to 1914 and how this? Well,
in a way, it is 100-year war by the Anglo-American patriarchs to prevent the cohesion of Western continental Europe, symbolized by Germany, the strongest economic factor in continental Europe, and Russia, the largest country on the face of the earth. It goes all the way to the Pacific. And they have every raw material. They have a skilled labor force today. They have a defense force, we've seen that in Syria, that makes the Pentagon generals blush because of all the junk equipment that the corrupt procurement process of the last 40, 50 years has given to the U.S. Armed Forces. So the Mackinder was a genius, and people throw around often this term geopolitics, and it's really worthwhile to go into the original sources. The father of geopolitics is Halford Mackinder, an advocate of empire, the British Empire, to his very death. And he saw this as the most positive force on the planet. And he said, the nation or the power that controls Central Europe, and by that he meant Germany, France, Poland, and so forth, has the potential to control the heartland. And for Mackinder, the heartland was two different entities at different times. It was Russia, the Tsarist Russia. This was in 1904, his famous essay, The Geographical Pivot of History. It's a beautiful, profound piece of work. I recommend anybody who's serious about understanding foreign policy and politics today to go to the library and read the original. He said in a writing he did after the Versailles Conference, or during the Versailles Conference in 1919, he said, the nation who controls Central Europe controls the heartland. And who controls the heartland, i.e. Russia, controls the world island, which is all of Eurasia going right down to the oil-rich Middle East countries and parts of Africa, like Libya. And he who controls the world island controls the world. And the corollary to that, which he didn't make explicit, but it's obvious from his writings, is that British foreign policy and later American foreign policy is a Mackinder foreign policy. Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the key foreign policy voices of the post-1945 U.S. foreign policy, were all students of Halford Mackinder. Mackinder, before his death, wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs, the bi-monthly magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations, then totally dominated by the Rockefeller faction. I believe it was 1943, shortly before the end of the war. And he said, it's clear that America will take over the torch that the British Empire has carried after this war. And this is the strategy she should follow. And that is what has been followed, to keep the continental European countries from any independent foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia. When de Gaulle got fed up with the U.S. Cold War and all the manipulations, and they were manipulations, by the way, he tried to make deals between France and the Soviet Union on energy and various other things. And what did the CIA do? They created a color revolution called May 1968. That was one of the first CIA Rand Corporation color revolutions, using various student proxy groups that the CIA had trained in different universities across France to literally drive de Gaulle out of office, and it succeeded. So the Mackinder's strategy, divide and rule, but this idea of the land power and the sea power, actually Admiral Mahon on the U.S. side elaborated on the original Mackinder ideas with his naval power. But today, in today's world, this is really less and less relevant. And that's the frightening thing for the Pentagon and for people in Washington, the frightening thing that Shoigu's armed forces of the Russian Federation demonstrated in Syria after September 30th, where they could fire missiles from relatively tiny warships in the Black Sea. Now, you should look on a map and see where these places are to get an idea, and hit targets in Syria with micro precision. That shocked the bejesus out of U.S. military.
So, this corrupt military-industrial complex that has, metastasized since the end of World War II. It's more of a a wealth transfer scheme, a money laundering scheme, than it is a program to provide for the national defense. And so now, while many people are getting rich off it, contractors and corporations like that, they're not delivering. Like the F-35, right? Who knows what they're doing with all that money, billions and billions, and there's always the issue of the black budget and it being embezzled, and when you have that much money being spent, and of course the Pentagon has never been audited, right? Despite the law.
Never been audited. How can this be? I thought we were a democracy. Isn't the United States the flagship of democracy and transparency for the world?
Mm-hmm.
Why has the Federal Reserve never been audited? Why has the Pentagon never been audited? Ooh.
Well, and of course you have Donald Rumsfeld talking about $2.2 trillion just went missing on September 10th of 2001.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, of course, that's knocked off the front pages by the subsequent events. Interesting to fact there.
Yeah. I remember that very well.
Yeah. So there's a lot. There's with the cryptocracy and secret agencies and black budgets. It's no telling. There's no accountability anymore. There's no oversight. Oversight's a joke. Yeah. So the room for corruption is just immense. However, U.S. military, if it faces a lean and mean operation like they apparently have in Russia, that there might be some trouble there, which I think ultimately is a healthy thing. If it gives the people in the Pentagon pause, that might actually keep the peace. It's an important balance. I think that's missing.
Let's hope so, because these neocons who never put on a uniform and had to face the prospect of having their head blown off in combat. Robert Kagan, the male companion of Victoria Nuland, I don't know what he is in other terms, the co-founder of the Project for the New American Century, along with Dick Cheney and Jeb Bush and Donald Rumsfeld and all the, Paul Wolfowitz and all these stupid idiots who ran the Iraq War and the Afghan War for Bush Jr. W. They have the mental capacities that are so much lower than, I hesitate to say this, than a Henry Kissinger. Zbigniew Brzezinski is just ideologically nuts about Russia, so I won't include him. Kissinger is an evil man. He's done evil in his entire career. He's not a good person, but at least he has some intellectual substance when he says demonizing Vladimir Putin is not a strategy.
Yes.
This is not a strategy. What is the strategy of the Pentagon? What is the strategy of the Obama administration, of Hillary Clinton, of Donald Trump vis-a-vis Russia today? I can tell you, I was invited as a panelist at the annual St. Petersburg International Economic Forum this past June, and I had a chance to meet and talk with some of the leading Russian heads of state industry, energy groups, power groups, across the board, and they are just shaking their heads at the stupidity and the craziness coming out of the West to accuse Putin of hacking the Democratic National Committee emails. It's like everything wrong that happens, Vladimir Putin is behind it. They have television programs in Russia. A Russian friend of mine sent me the YouTube of this, where they make like Monty Python fictional representations of these crazy Americans as the Russians view. And they are hilariously to the point. They just say that these people are mentally unbalanced in Washington.
Well, as your subtitle to your latest book, right?
Mm-hmm. Whom the gods would destroy. May I take a minute, Tim, to explain the cover and the title of the book?
Yes, you have. It's a white cover with a gray hard to see. The Lost Hegemon,
Yes,
fading
deliberately so.
away. And you have a torn up American flag here. And of course, in black lettering is "Whom the Gods Would Destroy." It's a very simple but very beautiful cover, I think.
Thank you. It's a dear friend of mine had the conception. And it's so powerful because the lost hegemon is, of course, Washington, the United States of America. The strategy that was so confidently undertaken in 1945, 46, when Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, the Cold War strategy, the strategy of the U.S. is number one guarantor of the world, that is collapsing. And like all empires, if you don't like the word empire, you have to look at what de facto is happening with Washington and its exercise of power, because that is an imperial exercise of power. And the neocons, at least on that point, I have to agree with. It is an empire. Every other thing, they're just lunatics. But they're the PR firm of the military-industrial complex, if you want to demystify the neocons. They find ways to justify war everywhere and all the time to prop up the Pentagon budget at times when it looks like it's about to collapse. So they're not at all looking out for America's interests. They're looking out for the interests of the military-industrial complex. In any case, so the the lost hegemon, all of these strategies, the Arab Spring, that was a Hillary Clinton made in Washington, CIA, National Endowment for Democracy, Soros Foundation, Rand Corporation, Gene Sharp, Albert Einstein Institution, Color Revolution, Mach 10 across the Arab world. And the aim was to install US-controlled Muslim Brotherhood governments from Egypt to Tunisia to Libya to ultimately Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. And I talked to Kuwaitis who were terrified back then in 2011 and so that they were going to get a Muslim Brotherhood toppling the royal family. And then there was a deal cut between Obama and the royals of the Gulf Arab states that they would back off. But they actually managed to get Hillary Clinton, and Huma Abedin. By the way, Huma Abedin, people should look up her name if they don't know it by now. She is the right-hand man of, she's the right-hand woman of Hillary Clinton. She's Muslim Brotherhood from her nose to her toes. Her entire family is Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a death cult. I go into this in great detail in The Lost Hegemon. If people have the slightest interest in what this phenomenon is called jihadist radical Islam that's sprung upon us since 9/11, 2001, and certainly since the Syria war, they really would find it useful to get a copy of the book Lost Hegemon and through Amazon or whatever, and study this, because it's a fascinating story. It's a story of collusion between the CIA, old Nazi networks in Munich, Germany in the 1950s, and the Muslim Brotherhood, bringing them into Saudi Arabia, marrying them with Saudi oil money and the Saudi fanatical Wahhabism as a evangelical force of radical Islam that was sent to Pakistan and later to Afghanistan. And that laid the seeds for the Mujahideen in the 1980s, which was Brzezinski's and the CIA's project, and against the Soviet Red Army. And then into Azerbaijan, into Chechnya. The CIA ran this whole Chechen war against Russia, against oil pipelines from Baku, is what it was all about. And it's if you want to understand the last 50 years of politics from the standpoint of the U.S. relation to political Islam, I think you will very much enjoy The Lost Hegemon.
Yes, that was one of the key insights in your book, is the fact that the Islamic radicals that we are told to fear and are proxy soldiers for Anglo-American NATO,
Hmm.
and they've been created by these by the West in order to destabilize the Middle East and others, like also as well as Eastern Europe. One of the
Yeah.
key things is the intersection here, or at least connection between the destabilization of the Caucasus region in the 90s and the Balkans, and also the subsequent events in North Africa and the Middle East. All
Yeah.
these groups, and one character that plays a prominent role in your book here is one Graham Fuller, and his name pops up in the latest coup attempt in Turkey, which
Yeah.
factors into this geostrategy here.
Yeah.
Do you want to get into that?
Sure. Well, Graham E. Fuller, so-called retired around the time of the Iran-Contra scandal because he was the CIA architect of that scandal during the Bush senior administration, or not. Bush was vice president still at that point, but Reagan Bush. And he retired from the agency to go over to the agency's RAND Corporation as a kind of a sheep dipping cover spotlight and get the CIA out of the spotlight for the Iran Contra. But Graham E. Fuller was one of the architects of this operation of the CIA called Mujahideen. The Mujahideen, and translated, simply means the holy warriors. And they trained the most bloodthirsty, fanatical psychopaths they could recruit. And what's interesting about the Mujahideen is that the CIA worked with the then head of Saudi intelligence, who was head of Saudi intelligence until very, very recently, to recruit fundamentalist Saudis, fundamentalist Islamists from all around the world, from Sudan, elsewhere, and so forth, but from the Arab world. And Saudi intelligence brought a young Saudi, very wealthy young Saudi, to Pakistan, where he set up something called the base, which in Arabic is called Al Qaeda. The base is simply the data processing center of all the names of the recruits. And his name was Osama bin Laden. Now, isn't that interesting? Osama worked for the CIA and Saudi intelligence in the whole Mujahideen recruiting process. Later, he was discovered in Bosnia during the US incited Yugoslav war in the 1990s. He was discovered in Bosnia. Izetbegovic, the US elected president of Bosnia, a Muslim, whose roots go back to the Muslim Brotherhood Nazi brigades of World War II as a young man. Osama bin Laden shows up there, and these Mujahideen were brought into Bosnia to fight against the Serbs. So most everything that we have been told in the Western media, CNN or BBC and so forth, about the Yugoslav war is a pack of lies. The Serbs, it even came out now, this is quite a shocking revelation. The Hague Tribunal a few days ago made a review excuse me, made a review of the indictment of the now dead Slobodan Milosevic, the president of Serbia, who was indicted by the Hague Tribunal some years ago for war crimes against Bosnians and Croatians. I said, this is not true. He was not guilty of war crimes. But of course, now nobody remembers that. Nobody thinks about it. So, this is what America calls the export of democracy. You take American democracy or we'll kill you. That's kind of the message. So it's a form of regime change. It's a form of creating puppet governments, every bit as puppetized as Stalin's regimes in Eastern Europe were during the Cold War. Mm-hmm. No difference.
And one thing you describe wonderfully in your book is the process. And I had to kind of refresh my memory on what was going down because I remember witnessing it in the 90s, the war against Yugoslavia or Serbia then, how Yugoslavia, then Serbia was literally dismantled
Yeah,
by NATO, which actually NATO's war against Serbia was completely illegal, a violation of its charter.
yeah,
I mean, completely outside any understanding of why NATO should exist. For one thing, because the Red Army had long since gone away, but NATO
yeah.
persisted. But Congress itself passed an aid bill which made secession a requirement to receive aid,
Yeah.
and it's how they got.
And
Yeah.
exactly in 1989, and they brought in the International Monetary Fund to be the economic hitman, as John Perkins calls him,
Hmm.
uh, and demanded of Yugoslavia that they dismember into Slovenia, into Croatia, Republic of Croatia, Hrvatska, into the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Interesting thing about Bosnia-Herzegovina, at the beginning of the war in the early 90s, the ethnic composition of Bosnia-Herzegovina was one third Muslim, one third Croatian, and one third Croatian being Roman Catholic, and one third Eastern Orthodox Serbs. But you have the impression that it's a Muslim state because the U.S. put their man, Izetbegovic, in as the puppet president to wage this holy war with the Mujahideen against the Serbs.
And this was to prevent or secure pipeline routes, and also to build that huge camp. Was it Bondsteel?
On steel, yeah.
Yeah.
The largest camp since the Vietnam War that the U.S. military has constructed up until the Iraq War. And through there, Bond Steel, the U.S. military has a launching pad throughout Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and so forth. So that's one of the major motives. But the other motive, I think, was simply to create a war in the belly of Europe, the soft underbelly, as Churchill called the Balkans, to show Europe and show the world that Europe could not stop war in its own backyard, and therefore NATO has to continue. That's rubbish because NATO networks of the U.S. created that war. So, yeah, they're not very good at being truthful, these warmongers.
One of the consistencies that I see, or patterns in all these dirty wars and destabilization efforts. Well, one thing is you get the same people like General Secord, who was involved in Air America in Vietnam with the arms shipments and the heroin. He was also involved in the cocaine in the 80s out of Latin America in support of the Contra operation and the drugs. Yeah. And then here he is working in the 21st century, shipping in radical Muslims and also arms through this, was the Mega Oil Corporation, this front?
Yeah, to Azerbaijan, Baku.
Yeah.
Because British and American intelligence wanted control of the Baku from the Russians. And, this is...
So it's the same thing, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing as the destabilization, because from what I understand is areas like Chechnya, where the Muslims there were rather peaceful, and they were, of course, stirred up or rather imported.
Well, there's these Osama bin Laden Mujahideen first came in, and they recruited the 19-year-old unemployed, hothead youth that had no identity, and with drugs and various things, they turned them into psychopaths. And then, once you get the war kicked off with these, they were in Chechnya, they were known as the Arab Chechens because they were all Arab speaking, but they had money and guns, so they managed to do a lot of damage.
And of course, when you create these arenas of bloodletting, destabilization, you create lucrative networks for heroin trafficking and human trafficking, which, from what I understand, are networked through NATO headquarters in Brussels.
Oh, okay.
So
that surprised me in the least.
Yeah. But I mean that goes way back. I mean, look at the end of World War II when the Luciano Project. And the idea of facilitating, in support of the war against the communism, first there was fascism, then communism.
Yeah, in Italy.
Well,
Yeah,
Italy is they sent Luciano over there and sort of gave him the franchise for the drugs coming through Marseille. This is the French connection.
yeah,
And then you have Vietnam, which facilitated, the heroin trade, and Meyer
yeah.
Lansky was involved in that. And you have characters like Paul Helliwell, who could link back to Resort International and the Mary Paint Company and all these fronts.
Mary Carter Paint Company.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Mary Carter Paint Company. And one thing about your book is all these names pop up, and I come across all these names in my other research. It's like, you know, almost like they never go away.
deja vu all over again.
Yeah,
I used to say.
yeah. It's like, and there's a again, one of the key insights in this book is that we're told that we're fighting the war on terror to fight Islamic radicalism, but the fact of the matter is that our enemy is being created
Yeah,
by the intelligence agencies, by the defense, by Pentagon.
yeah. Pentagon and CIA.
Yeah, and that's the
And
key.
now the line is so blurred since Donald Rumsfeld tried to merge defense intelligence into CIA, and Petraeus went from the Pentagon to CIA and so forth. It's a mess.
One thing that was interesting is the character Graham Fuller, how back during the Boston bombing.
Mm.
Want to explain his connection to that incident? Because that's telling. I mean,
Graham E. Fuller, this very, very senior CIA man who, by the way, was so uncomfortable that his name appeared in connection with Fethullah Gulen that he wrote a blog piece on his own blog the day after the failed coup on 16th of July in Turkey, saying that, yes, I signed a petition for the exceptional green card allowance of Fethullah Gulen, this fake imam that's been credited by, I think quite correctly, by Erdogan and people in Turkey being behind the coup. But Graham Fuller, at the time of the Boston bombing, this is one of the strangest things that I've ever seen, except most of these school shootings and so forth, when you look into them in great detail, are strange, but I can't follow them all. But the Boston bombing in particular, you had video films of showing a young man with supposedly his leg blown off by a bomb to the bone from the kneecap down, and yet there's not a drop of blood, and suddenly the man gets carried in a wheelchair with this not drop of blood, bone without muscle and sinew and blood veins or anything, leg, and he seems to be quite happy. So they got some pretty poor actors to do some of these things around the Boston bombing. But the two young Chechens that were the Tsarnaev brothers that were made the patsies for this, I think the original aim of this was to somehow blame it on Vladimir Putin and the Russian intelligence, which failed miserably. And because Russian intelligence provided information to the CIA and to the FBI and to the US government on these brothers, and they had warned about them several years before. But Graham E. Fuller had a very interesting relation with the Uncle Ruslan Tsarnaev, of these two Tsarnaev boys that ultimately were fried because the U.S. government needed a scapegoat, in my view. Uncle Ruslan married the daughter of Graham E. Fuller in the 1980s and lived in the house of Graham E. Fuller with Fuller's daughter for a period. He also, Uncle Ruslan, worked for Dick Halliburton's company, Dick Cheney's Halliburton company in Central Asia, in Baku and elsewhere, and with various companies that are identified as CIA cutouts. So it was so embarrassing that this leaked out that Graham E. Fuller was forced to hold a press conference denying that he had anything to do with the two hooligan Tsarnaev boys who did this horrible Boston bombing. Now that, if you know anything about the world of intelligence, and I've been in journalism research, investigating area for 39 some years, and I have met a lot of people in different national intelligence capacities. If you know anything about how that world works, and it's a spooky world, you never draw attention to yourself. It's a kiss of death. So Graham E. Fuller panicked around the Boston bombing by acknowledging that his daughter married this uncle Ruslan, and somehow hoped it would go away. That was a blunder from a pure professional CIA spook rule book. That was a stupid thing to do. He panicked. Now, in the Istanbul, the failed coup d'etat of Fethullah Gulen's networks with money provided by quote unquote retired CENTCOM generals and Afghan commanders and so forth. It's reported that Graham E. Fuller and his very, very close friend, a CIA agent named Barkey, were holed up in a really luxury hotel. I'd love to be a guest at that hotel, on an island 20 minutes boat ride away from Istanbul on the night of the failed coup, along with 17 other international unidentified spooks, because they were all ushered in privately by Barkey, this CIA buddy of Graham Fuller's. And the day later, Graham Fuller felt again compelled to write in his blog, and people can look this up. I footnoted it in an article I published on this recently. He said, point in interest of full disclosure, I did sign a letter in 2006, actually it was 2007, recommending green card status for Fethullah Gulen in Pennsylvania, because he is not at all dangerous to the United States. That, by the way, is a lie. What he didn't mention is that two other leading CIA figures, George Fetus and Morton Abramovich, the then U.S. ambassador to Turkey, also signed that letter, and that overrode the objections of the U.S. State Department, which said the Fethullah Gulen organization is reportedly financed by Saudi money and by CIA money, and there were allegations that Gulen is involved in the drug trade. So the fact that Graham E. Fuller, on the day after the failed coup in Turkey, feels again compelled to go public and in such a detail, indicates the man has brown underpants, if you excuse the crude expression, about being caught with his hand in the cookie jar.
Now, Chris, you mentioned the Fethullah, before I let you go for the evening, the Fethullah Gulen network, this Samat, I think it's called. Is it Samat? Is the word? Yeah. Quickly explain that, and what purpose is it serving, and how is it? How is he useful to Western intelligence?
Well, Gulen's Samat was created by the CIA back in the 1980s. He was picked up as the man has a fifth grade education. He dropped out of the fifth grade. He's not a world-renowned Muslim scholar in the tradition of Rumi and all this nonsense that's peddled about him. He has a grandfatherly look about him. He's got a chubby face and a white mustache and white hair, but that's about it. Sits there in Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania. But he is simply the face man for a network that the CIA built up over the last 30 years in Turkey. And if you look at the map of the Turkic ethnic peoples. It goes all the way from Istanbul or Anatolia into Xinjiang province with the Uyghur, they call it East Turkestan, uh, Uyghur people in China, which is one of the big sources of unrest and terrorism in China, because the Turkic Uyghurs, the unemployed youth, are recruited by Gulen networks to come as university students, first in Istanbul, where Gulen has many universities, and then once inside that network of Gulen, they're the ones who are suitable are brought in to be trained as jihadists and sent to Syria to carry out terrorism against Assad's regime. And then at a certain point, if they survive that, they're sent back into China to make terrorism in China for the, jihad, the global caliphate.
And these various networks of schools that he operates often operate as cover for CIA operatives, correct?
Well, also the fact he has, I think, something like 120 charter schools with U.S. taxpayers' support across America.
Oh, okay.
And there have been huge corruption scandals, embezzlement of funds, charges against these Gulen schools in Texas and other states in the United States. People would do well to look into this because it's an American problem too. And the organization has been compared to Scientology, which is not too surprising because CIA created Scientology, Ron Hubbard, as well as the Gulen organization. But it uses this fake Islam beard or mask to infiltrate. During the collapse of the Soviet Union, Central Asia became an open field for the first time for the CIA. So they used Gulen to set up schools, Islamic schools. Who could question, religious Islamic schools? That's not, and from Turkey, this is, so it was a perfect cover. And the former head of Turkish intelligence, who's now deceased, wrote his memoirs about 8 or 10 years ago. And he revealed that 130 English native speaking teachers in these schools, because one of the things they offered was that your elites in Uzbekistan or Tajikistan or Kazakhstan and so forth can learn English from native speakers. And of course, in 1990, 1992, 93, and so these countries were desperate. Anything American was salvation from the horrors of the Soviet Union. And I said 130 of these were CIA agents. And as native English teachers, they all had diplomatic passports. Well, I used to be a native English teacher in a foreign country, and no one offered me a diplomatic passport. So I can tell you this is very bizarre. Russia closed the schools down pretty early because they realized what was going on in Chechnya. This was Putin, by the way, back in the 1999 and 2000. And now those schools all over the world, the Erdogan government is requesting in Sudan, in India, and Nigeria, and places you couldn't imagine, that they be aware of the danger and close them down. Those Gulen schools are all over Germany. Some leading members of the German political class think that Gulen is one of the good guys of Islam, so we should support him against these firebrand jihadists. Well, he's a deep cover death cult, and he's one retired German professor of Islamic studies said he's the most dangerous Islamist in Germany.
Yeah, so it's similar to like the Freemasonic lodge system, I guess. These pockets of destabilization and
well, but a Freemasonic lodge system that is designed to, it's a very specific network.
Mm-hmm.
As this Turkic network, and it's absolutely crucial to the U.S. strategy of dominating the entire Eurasia, Central Asia, the Middle East oil, and so forth. So if Erdogan decisively turns against this, which it appears quite possible since the failed coup, and orients closer to Russia and to China and to the Shanghai Cooperation countries. This could be one of the most decisive political shifts, geopolitical shifts,
Mm-hmm.
Since World War II.
Yes, and outside the threats coming from the West, there's no reason why they shouldn't do this.
Yeah,
Yeah, and so
yeah. It's a messy thing. Erdogan himself is a messy person.
yeah,
Excuse me for being blunt. Uh, he's a survivor. He's not very deep on moral principle. He's a survivor, but you know, Putin and the Russians are used to dealing with unprincipled survivors and offering them an offer they can't refuse. And I think that's what happened in the meeting in Sochi with Erdogan and Putin.
yeah. When you're studying these things, it's not a question of finding good guys and bad guys. It's a question of acknowledging the importance of power blocks and checks and balances to the system. And at the very least, if you do get some sort of opposition, maybe from the BRIC countries or from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it could. I mean, it's dangerous. I mean, it's a powder keg if some of these people misstep or they miscalculate. But it is. It's a reintroduction of a balance of power that's been solely missing since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
And which is the broad look at this stuff. We're not in the business of picking good guys versus bad guys. But I do think the side that is most drunk on power, the most I guess the most insane, as the gods have driven crazy right now, is the Anglo-American NATO bloc. And
yeah,
so
I would agree with that.
Yeah. So at this point, well, listen,
it's tragic, it's sad, but it's how it is.
Yeah, and I guess we can hope that there's a peaceful resolution of these things. We return to some sense of normalcy to international affairs, since we haven't had since probably since September 1939, arguably since August 1914, maybe perhaps. So, yeah, another important point in this book is we're talking about all these I guess intrigues, interventions, destabilization efforts, proxy wars in the Middle East, North Africa, Eastern and Central Europe, the Caucasus, directed at Russia and China. It's not just about securing oil fields or pipelines or drug trafficking routes and military contracts. There seems to be a much more sinister agenda afoot here, and I think you sum it up well here on page 6 of The Lost Hegemon. If I may, I'm going to read the paragraphs. You write, on one level, the Islamic State war was about oil, gas, and pipelines to control the vast oil riches of the region, as well as to deny Russia the South Stream gas route to a Europe independent of Ukraine. On a deeper level, the IS war was part of a larger global strategy to defeat the only effective resistance to the creation of a new 21st century universal fascism, a return to the dark times of the Middle Ages, but on a world scale. One world that would be controlled by very rich Western families whose agenda was total control over the world and the reduction of global population through eugenics, wars, and terrorism. The Washington War against Syria and the U.S.-created war in Ukraine were two fronts in what in reality was one war. It was a war against Russia and, at the same time, a war against China. Those two Eurasian powers, the key nations of the BRICS and of the Eurasian Shanghai Cooperation Organization, represented the center of gravity for the only effective counterweight to a new global fascist barbarism, a barbarism the Pentagon called full-spectrum dominance, and the American oligarch David Rockefeller called his New World Order. Listen, William, I want to thank you. I know you're a little under the weather tonight for coming on my show and spending so much time with me and explaining these things. I think we handled a lot of issues in the amount of time that we're given. Again, the book is The Lost Hegemon, Whom the Gods Would Destroy by F. William Engdahl. What's the best place to get this book?
The best place in the States is Amazon or directly on my web. No, Amazon. Amazon is the best place. You can order it through bookstores, but that takes longer. And that gives me the best financial support for my continued work.
Excellent. And your website is williamengdahl.com. And I think if you sign up there, you get like a free newsletter that you send out.
Every 2 weeks, you get a free newsletter with unpublished information that people seem to enjoy very much because it's very popular now. I just initiated that, and I'm in the process of uh, developing a format for voice. What do you call it? MP3. Not lectures. I don't like that word lecture, but
Talks.
talks.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good word. Thank you. Talks about geopolitics in
Oh,
the
excellent.
world. Yeah,
Oh,
I would sell those for some nominal amount of money to further support my work, and looking for ways to keep this thing going without driving me into the ground.
Yeah, these independent. It's tough being an independent
Yeah.
researcher or scholar because you don't get the benefit of a Rockefeller Foundation grant or something. Or
Nor do I want.
yeah, exactly. With those strings attached, right?
Yeah.
Political and moral. So great. Okay, listen. Thank you, and perhaps we'll talk again in the future sometime, and something else comes up
Yeah,
if you have time.
I'd love to.
And I really enjoyed the talk. And I'll wish you good night. And when I put this up, I will send you the link.
Great.
It'll probably be very soon because there was no editing required in this one. It was perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
And
I enjoyed it. It was a easy flowing talk.
it's great. Thank you. And I'll wish you good night. And so long.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye bye.